Dr. Coles, I'd like to know what neuroleptics are because I read some ominous information about how they were prescribed for dissidents in Russia, and now we're giving them to our children. Like, what exactly are they?
Yeah, they're synthetic chemicals that are designed to suppress dopamine transmission, so they're dopamine blockers, basically.
Okay.
Another word for them is antipsychotics or anti-schizophrenic drugs.
Okay.
The earliest version was Thorazine. Thorazine it was introduced in the United States in about 55 or so, right at the time when psychiatrists were doing widespread lobotomies, ice pick lobotomies.
Oh, yes.
And
Lobotomies.
for people with mental illness or disruptive behaviors or so-called schizophrenia or psychosis. And it worked with a high mortality rate. But right about that time, there was a backlash against the lobotomies. People were seeing bad effects and permanent effects. Rose Kennedy's daughter, Jack Kennedy's sister, was one that was victimized by a lobotomy, and she was mentally retarded the rest of her life. So she was just one of these. But they found out that Thorazine actually did the same thing, and they called it a chemical lobotomy. You could actually suppress the brain so that you were kind of in a daze. You were semi-zombified. And so it was very popular because disruptive people or people who were having hallucinations would just kind of be so woozy that they stopped being a problem. They didn't ask questions. Well, it also is disabling. Those drugs, when those are forced on anybody, you don't have to have a mental illness to have an adverse effect from it. So you and I, if we took that stuff, we wouldn't be able to function. We would hate that stuff. So they found out that it works on criminals.
I was going to ask, the criminally insane. That's
Criminally
what
insane, they use it on those, yeah. And in Russia, as you said, if you had a political dissident who was a poet and making a fuss over, the politics and they were activists, you could just put them in an insane asylum and give them drugs like Thorazine or any of the dozens of knockoffs which had similar molecular structures. They all kind of worked about the same, but they were patentable because they had slightly different chemical structures. They could be made into zombies, and then they would stop resisting. They would stop being their activist. It retards their activist nature or their creative nature.
Okay.
So the singers stop singing and the poets stop, writing poetry against the government. Well, we're doing the same thing in the United States. It wasn't just Russia.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, people who ask too many questions. They're nuisances. We can get them on a medication. Maybe we don't lock them up, but in the penal system in the United States, huge minorities, maybe majorities, actually are on medications like that. If you were in solitary confinement and destined to be there for decades of the rest of your life, I think you would want to be on an anti-schizophrenia drug that would make you into a zombie. How else could you tolerate being locked up, But as long as you keep persons on that drug, they lose their ability to fight or resist. They're just sluggish. And so they're easier to handle. It's kind of a control mechanism. They used to call them chemical straitjackets.
Okay.
Put people in a straitjacket, and you don't have to worry about them. They might be able to kick you, but they're not going to be able to knife you. And so these are chemical lobotomies, chemical straitjackets. Now we're giving these medications to children, and they have never been approved.
Where? Who?
Well, the foster children are just massively dosed with these things, huge majorities.
Foster children?
Foster children who are orphans or estranged from or taken away from their violent homes or malfunctioning families are then placed in foster care with accredited foster families. But, the health, there's no healthy, it's rare to have a healthy parent-child relationships. When a person is a foster kid, they're rebellious, they don't, you aren't my dad, why should I obey you? There's that rebellious nature. So it's a rare situation where kids really adapt and do well in foster care situations. So if they're drugged, they're a little less likely to fight back or be disruptive or whatever. They're sleepy, so they go to bed. They sleep longer when they're on these drugs. So they're just easier to control and easier to manage. but they have never been approved for use in children under the age of 18. Been no studies in children. There aren't long-term studies in rats even with these drugs. They're short-term studies.
Mm-hmm.
The long-term studies that the independent researchers do shows them brain damaging, but the pharmaceutical industry that does most of the research doesn't test them for brain damage. Or if they do, they shelve it and they don't let anybody see the adverse results. Since those drugs are so sedating, these anti-schizophrenic drugs are so sedating, they're commonly used in kids who are manic-y or maybe even having side effects to Ritalin. You know, you can have mania from the SSRIs, that's common. You can have mania from the psychostimulants, the Ritalin type drugs. And so this is a kind of an antidote to the adverse effects of these psychostimulants and other medications. So oftentimes drugs like that are given at night because now it's pretty certain that you can't stay awake when you're given a drug like Zyprexa or Abilify or Clozaril, etc. But there's been studies, well, forever. I mean, within 10 years after Thorazine was introduced, there were cases of Parkinson's disease. And that's the other thing. It's almost identical to Parkinson's disease. Permanent brain damage to the substantial nigra and other brain cell or midbrain brainstem nuclei are destroyed in certain percentages with drugs like Thorazine or Haldol. And so it's common to get like tardive dyskinesia. That's that involuntary muscle thing. You're kind of doing this. And that's a permanent sign of brain damage from drugs. You don't get that from anything but brain damage from a chemical. And the most common cause is the antipsychotic drugs. So you get tardive dyskinesia, you get akathisia, A-K-A-T-H-I-S-I-A, akathisia. And that's this internal restlessness. You just can't sit still. You can't sit still. You got to move around all the time, and you have trouble sleeping too. And it can be so intolerable when it's chronic that people are known to commit suicide because of psychotropic drug-induced akathisia, and they just can't stand this. It's sort of like having restless legs all over your body and in your brain. You just can never be comfortable, and it's so intolerable in some cases that they'll throw themselves off a cliff or commit suicide. So, in fact, within a couple years of Prozac's institution, there was a report in the American Journal of Psychiatry that showed that 3 suicide attempts were on the basis of akathisia happened from Prozac. That was just in a couple years of institution. These psychiatrists saw this as they knew that it was Prozac-induced akathisia. Up to that time, akathisia was thought to be solely caused by the anti-schizophrenia drugs. Now we know that Prozac can do it too, and a cause of suicidality. So these are dangerous drugs. They're addicting because they cause withdrawal effects when you try to quit them. That means they're addicting. Not that people like them.
Right.
I mean, nobody likes to take antipsychotics. You don't get a buzz. You don't get a high. So you don't like them. But when you stop them, then you have terrible adverse effects from mania to insomnia to agitation to anxiety. And so this huge dilemma exists. You're taking a drug that's toxic and you can't get off of it. You're addicted to a poison. What a terrible dilemma that is. You know you don't want to be on it, but when you go off of it, you have terrible withdrawal symptoms. It's a serious situation. What a dilemma for someone. Just like cigarette smoking, Most cigarette smokers want to quit. They don't like it, But they feel so lousy when they're not smoking that they have to keep on with the poison. Voila, early death. Same way with the antipsychotics, early death. And it's causing disruption not just to the brain and nerves, it's also causing problems to the heart and other organ systems. So.
Thank you, Dr. Coles.
You're welcome.